for me to.
Hey, hello everyone. We're so glad that you're with us. This is a briefing on the Election Overtime Project. We're grateful that you're spending a little bit of time to talk with us about this program that is a collection of legal and policy tools that are intended to support journalists in covering the very specific challenge of close, contested, and disputed elections. Most of you in this audience are Pennsylvania reporters, and you know that you're a state that is statistically likely to have some of those. And so today's presentation, as you can see from the agenda, is a set of previews from speakers across the political spectrum. This panel does include Republicans, Democrats, Independents. They probably mightily disagree on specific policies facing our nation, but they are spectacularly united in their commitments to trusted elections in our country. They are all also part of the Election Overtime Speakers Bureau, meaning that they will be available to you throughout the election cycle as commentators or expert sources to help you as journalists cover the election with accuracy and with confidence in terms of the material that you're putting forward. So we're really grateful that they're with us today and that you're all with us to learn a little bit about this election overtime program. So on today's panel, we have Kevin Johnson, who's the executive director of the Election Reformers Network, Judge John Jones, who's the former chief judge of the U.S. Middle District Court of Pennsylvania. We have former Secretary Kathy Boockvar, who served as Secretary of the Commonwealth during the most recent presidential election. Emma Schuker, who's an election policy attorney with Represent Us, and Jennifer Morell, who is the CEO and founder of the Elections Group. So we are pleased with this group. And let me just also share with you that I'm Heather Balas with the Election Reformers Network. What I'd most like to let you know is that the entire team at ERN, along with our sponsors and partners, we're coming to you today as journalists with a really deep spirit of service and collaboration, because we know that the job that you're going to be doing in this cycle is difficult. We know that you are coming at it through a commitment to accuracy. And we want you to know that all of us are focused every day. I think everybody on this panel is focused every single day on the urgency of trusted and well understood elections in our democratic republic. And we know that sound media coverage is really key to that. And so we are respectfully offering our support to the hardworking election reporters in our country. That support looks like this. It includes these state-specific policy briefs that I'm about to preview for you. Those were developed by the team at Election Reformers Network with advisors, including some of the people on this call. It includes the speakers bureaus that I mentioned, that includes the folks on this call, as well as a wider array of individuals that have agreed to step forward and help you as sources as unexpected matters arise during the electoral process. They also include a whole host of external resources. We've tried to say, let's not duplicate the work of other good people in the field, whether they be journalists or individuals that are working in democracy reform. And on the website, I'm going to show you, there's resources, places where you can link to all of that. These media briefings that we're doing, this is one of a dozen of these, and so we're grateful that you're with us for this one. But the last thing is something that's not live yet, but we're letting you know it's coming, which is a litigation tracker. Once we are in the election process itself, should there be contests and post-election court cases, we'll be posting those in a tracker on this website so that it's easier for you all to keep track of where those are. This project is running in the 7 states that are on your screen, and today's briefing is all about your state of Pennsylvania. I want to say 2 more things before we start talking with our panelist. And one of them is that the briefs, the election policy briefs that we think are the linchpin of this program, they're organized around 3 key pillars. pillars that are selected because they're each focusing on the spirit of engagement and transparency that crosses the US election process. Ours is not an electoral system where decisions are made behind closed doors. Ours is an electoral process that is extremely inclusive of the voters and the candidates and the observers and the judicial system. And all of that is reflected in the 3 pillars that are in front of you and these 12 key questions. I joke that 3 pillars and a dozen answers sounds a little bit like a country western song, but those dozen answers are reflected in what was for us 400 plus pages of comprehensive research in each state that was boiled down into a 25 or so page policy brief that we then provide for you on the electionovertime.org website. So we want to just make sure that you all know our intention is to help you when you're on deadline. You don't have time when you've got a deadline in the morning to go through 400 pages. We tried to do it for you and provide those resources, addressing all of that. So that's a quick preview of what we have done in anticipation of today's briefing. And then we're going to then shift to the second part of the work, which is aligning you with experts who can help you both today and as we move forward in the electoral process. So Kevin Johnson, Election Reformers Network Executive Director, I want you to do the thing that I do badly, which is please explain to this audience the significance of our sports metaphor in the title of the program, Election Overtime.
Yeah, it's lucky for me that Heather's not good at speaking sports because she does everything else brilliantly. And this way there's still a role for me at ERN. I get to talk about this one. But yes, there's a sports metaphor, a sports analogy kind of at the core of this program. And since we're talking about, Pennsylvania, the state that gave America its greatest quarterbacks, hopefully the analogy will resonate. And kind of the simple idea is that even the most passionate fans who come together and watch a game, and even if the score is incredibly close, no one walks away from the Super Bowl saying that their side won when it didn't. Sports fans trust the final score, win or lose, and part of the reason for that is that they know the rules. There are a million or so 9-year-olds out there who know that, for example, every touchdown in the NFL is automatically reviewed by video before the score officially counts. They know the difference between how overtime is played in college football versus pro football. This may seem like a simplistic aspiration, but wouldn't it be great if American voters could come to know kind of as much about the rules of elections as 9-year-olds know about the rules of football? That's kind of our goal here. And many of the things voters need to know kind of have parallels in sports. Sports create a lot of transparency, as Heather was talking about. So fans can see for sure what happened, and elections do the same thing by allowing parties and candidates to have observers in polling stations. In sports or in football, a coach can throw out a little thing that signals a challenge to a ruling on the field. That kind of happens also in elections because the losing candidate, if they have sufficient evidence, can challenge in court and have a hearing in court. And one of the things that all of this kind of creates is that in sports, all of this, helps the results be known and definite and not a matter of opinion. Who won an election, likewise, is not a subjective question. It's a matter of fact and a matter of law. And helping voters see the full process of what happens when elections are close and quote unquote go into overtime. Of course, there isn't really a tie, but it's close enough that we're saying it goes into overtime. Helping voters understand that process is one way to help it be well known and clear that elections too have rules that make it absolutely clear who won. So over to the next slide. That's my summary on the sports. And this slide gives one example, among many of how kind of both sides can get things wrong about the rules in important ways. This is an interview with former Congressman Adam Kinzinger, and he's talking about the risk of a constitutional crisis. He talks about Arizona and how, for example, if Kamala Harris wins, it's the Arizona legislature that certifies the results, he says. And they might refuse because it's such a sort of right-leaning legislature. If they refuse, what happens? It's a constitutional crisis. Well, as my fellow wonks here know, and I think it's probably a lot of reporters know, the state legislature does not certify presidential results. In fact, state legislatures have no role at all in presidential elections once elections happen. And that's valuable to know because there's been a lot of concern back in the prior election about the ways in which state legislatures might be brought in to be part of ideas that could effectively lead to sabotage. In fact, certification of the election in Arizona is by the Secretary of State. And then there is the issue of this, what's called the certificate of ascertainment by the governor. And if either refuses, judges can force them to do what's required of them by law. So just that quick summary. And then I want to point out that, Adam Kinzinger got this wrong, the interviewer got this wrong, and it turns out we happen to know 63% of Americans also got it wrong, the question of whether legislatures certify results. And we know that because we've just been out doing a survey of American voters to test what they know about some of the detailed facts. And the results of that survey are shown kind of on this next slide here. We're just finishing that report and we'll have that to folks soon, but I think it's an interesting snapshot into where there are weaknesses and also a surprise as to the fact that people misunderstand. The misunderstanding is actually quite even, both sides politically and both sides in terms of media sources. So more on that later. And over to you, Heather, for our next speaker. Thank you.
So one of the things that we are when we think about the election that we're in right now is how do we learn from elections of the past? Judge Jones on this call has been involved in multiple election cases in the past. In this week, just last week, former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani was disbarred in Washington after having already been disbarred in New York, in part because of false claims that he made in court to prevent Pennsylvania from certifying its election results in 2020. So, Judge, you presided over at least one of those cases, and you know firsthand what it was like to watch the media try to cover, complex court proceedings that they didn't have any idea were coming. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of election policies a little bit later in this program, I'm just going to ask you, what high-level observations do you have about how election cases were covered in 2020? What went right? What maybe didn't go right in terms of coverage of these kind of high-level, high-profile cases?
Well, thank you, Heather, and it's a pleasure to be with these distinguished co-panelists and all the various folks who are watching this presentation. I had my baptism by fire when I was chief judge of my court in mid-October of 2020, and somewhat interestingly, and it's sort of fun now, is that Kathy was the defendant in the case in her capacity as Secretary of the Commonwealth, and it's not often I get to do a Zoom with a defendant who appeared before me, delightful defendant, and Kathy and I happen to be friends. But that was a case that was brought to strike allegedly deceased voters from the rolls in predominantly, as it happened, Democratic areas of Pennsylvania by a group that labeled itself a public interest legal foundation. And long story short, the case was dismissed by me because the proof was non-existent or thin, other than some jumbled data and allegations that folks hadn't voted in sequential elections. And worse, the plaintiffs had the data for months and months and tried to erase it in at the last instant. And as I've told Heather, and as Kathy knows, the footnote to that is that in the infamous Four Seasons landscaping press conference that former Mayor Giuliani conducted sometime after the election, he was flapping a piece of paper in his hands and decrying the fact that dead people voted in Pennsylvania. That piece of paper happened to be my decision. Little known footnote in history, but you know what I learned along the way, and not just in this case, but in others, that I think is important for members of the media to know, is that a long time ago, when I was a baby lawyer, there were reporters who were beat reporters and covered individual courthouses, and of course, you don't have the resources to do that in most cases anymore, nor do federal courts typically have public information officers, and certainly county courts don't have them either. So you have to do some legwork to try to uncover these suits. The aforementioned suit the result was covered ultimately because people found it, but the actual proceedings weren't covered, and it wasn't covered in depth. We don't put out press releases. You have to rely on the media finding these cases out themselves. Now, in contrast, after the election, later in November, in a separate lawsuit that appeared on the docket, and it's now a pretty famous filing. Kathy was again a defendant in the famous Trump versus Bookvar case. And now, you know, I have a theory about that case, and my theory is this. I'll say this with all candor. I was the chief judge stationed in Harrisburg. Typically, by rights, those cases would be filed in Harrisburg because that's the situs of the Secretary of the Commonwealth. It was filed in the northern tier in front of my friend and former colleague Matthew Brand, a card-carrying member of the Federalist Society. I think there was a little bit of shopping that went on. Didn't work because the case went to at issue before Judge Brand argued not well by Mayor Giuliani, and ultimately he denied relief. But what we did in that case, and I was the chief judge, and this is instructive in terms of Heather's question, what we did right. We worked with the Administrative Office of the Federal Courts in Washington and set up an audio link. Of course, we don't televise proceedings. I think perhaps we should in some cases, but that's the rule handed down by the Supreme Court of the United States. But we did allow audio, and it worked pretty well. There were a couple drops, but generally people could hear that. So what I want to say in terms of news you can use is your first recourse when you find out that something is filed should be the clerk of the court. They're all their names in the three districts. There's the Eastern District, Middle District, Western District in Pennsylvania. Clerk's name is right there. You should call the clerk's office. That will help you. You can suggest that in a high-profile case that audio be provided. They may do that if there's sufficient interest. If you're not what's called a CMECF filer, where you can actually pull things off the docket, you can ask to see particular orders. We, in some high-profile cases, actually posted up orders on the court's website because they were of public interest. Courts are pretty good about doing that, so you don't have to register as a filer to get the information. And in some cases, and I stress some, because you know, it depends on the individual judge, you can talk to judges. Now that seems odd. Judges are not going to talk about the merits of a case. Judges are not going to comment on their decisions. That's forbidden territory, and you know, you don't want to try that. But judges want generally, and I certainly did, the media to get things right. And under certain circumstances, judges will, as a matter of background, if it's a confusing case or a complicated case, talk to members of the press simply to get them to understand better the ins and outs of a particular case. And then finally, before I send it back to Heather, I would strongly urge you, because you don't know whether you have a judge who's going to talk to you, or you know, hopefully the court clerk will help you, but have access to attorney experts. I think that's critical. Many members of the media have expert lawyers or former judges, as the case may be, that they can call to unpack things because the law is complicated, let's face it, and these are not intuitive, these cases. So you want to have somebody on speed dial that you can talk to right away who can kind of deconstruct some of these cases and speak to you in plain English about what they mean. So some things work right, some things didn't, but I think increasingly, at least in the federal courts, there's a greater nod towards the media and wanting to help the media get it right. Thanks. I think you're muted, Heather.
Yeah, sorry about that. So one of the things that we're hoping to talk about also is Secretary Bookvar, your perspectives from the last election before we go and shifting into the next one. And that is, so Judge Jones mentioned, like, bless your heart, your office was the named defendant in some of these cases. What did you see in terms of what the media, how the media handled those, and what wishes you might have for how the media had handled it in 2020?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here. Thanks to all of you. It's always a pleasure to be with Judge Jones and the rest of you. Judge Jones, also fun fact, in Pennsylvania, one of the places that the official Electoral College certificates need to go is to the chief judge of the Middle District of Pennsylvania. So somewhere I have a picture of my staff handing the documents to Judge Jones, a keeper of these very important, papers to help, prove that our democratic process actually works. So, yes. So I'll start out by saying, actually, I think a lot of what the press did in 2020 went well, in terms of their coverage of the cases in particular. As Judge Jones said, and Heather, as you said, they were complicated, but there was good reporting on a lot of them. I think part of what I think it's really tough, right? Because these things, right, which we have attached to our hips at all time, and people use to get their news and what that so-called news is, has a lot of competition these days. It's no longer, that clear where that line is of what actually is news and what is not news. But so it ups the responsibility of all of us and media to get out accurate information as broadly and as clearly and understandably, yes, quickly, but that's absolutely important. But I think sometimes the biggest problem that I've seen, and this is in 2020, but it's also in the years since, is this tendency to just the wanting to get things out quick interferes with the accuracy. And so, as Judge Jones says, I think one of the best things that's happening this year, and thank you to ERN and to other folks who are doing this, is you have us, a whole lot of us, who are going to be available quickly to give feedback as things happen. And so if there are going to be cases, as Judge Jones talked about, and what Emma and others are going to talk about, the sort of ongoing cases, there's going to be a lot of moving parts. Still a ton of litigation in Pennsylvania. It's hard to believe that some of the exact same issues still haven't been resolved in a final way. So we can help make sense of them, the past, the present, and the future. So use us. And I guess I would just also say, and this is not just about litigation. This is about official actions as they happen by the election officials and beyond. And this is not your fault, but I want to ask you all to be very careful how you write things. And I know you don't always control the headlines, but how you write headlines, because what happens is the way you say things in those articles, it can directly end up unintentionally becoming a source of disinformation that then leads to threats against election officials. And again, you can't, this is not at all blaming you for these things, but I ask you to be mindful of it, because it's amazing how just the way you phrase, one of my pet peeves is, I get that when somebody like Rudy Giuliani or former President Trump says something outrageous, I get that that's news in a sense, right? But when the first line of an article says, there was rampant fraud in 16 states across the nation that led to the election of X, said Rudy Giuliani, it's the first part that is what is going to be repeated. That's what people hear when you're writing it as news because Rudy Giuliani said it. So I just ask, the more you could be thoughtful about the unintended consequences of how you write these things, on behalf of all of us, thank you.
Good deal. All right. So we've gotten some really concrete suggestions so far from what we learned from the election in 2024. And then in the next step, what I want to do is back us up for 1 second to talk a little bit about the election that's coming up ahead of us. What's going to be different this time? We know that we've learned a lot in 4 years, and the electorate has learned a lot in 4 years. So Emma Schuker, this is a quick one, and then we're going to go to you for a longer one in a minute, but quick answer, gut reaction, what's going to be different in 2024?
And before you start, Heather, you don't have the right slide up. You might take your slides down or go to slideshow.
Is it not showing, Emma?
Very, very small on a screen of other stuff.
Let's see what we can do about that. You start talking, Emma, and I'll try to fix my tech here.
I think one of the things that is going to be very different from 2020, if everyone recalls, I'm sure that the count of the mail-in ballots in 2020 took 4 excruciating days. And there were several reasons for this. One was that the statute that allowed for universal mail-in voting had been passed at the end of 2019. So it was brand new. A pandemic had just hit, and the boards of election were still kind of in the process of working out how they were going to manage counting this massive influx of mail-in ballots, right? So prior to Act 77, there were absentee ballots, but it was just like this tiny fraction of the number that we saw in 2020 as a result of the universal mail-in balloting and the pandemic. Since that time, across the state, the boards of election have refined their processes for counting mail-in ballots. They have invested in additional personnel and additional equipment. And while I don't think anyone can promise that the results will be fully tabulated by midnight on election night, it would shock me if it took the length of time that it took in 2020. So, for example, I think 2022 is a really good instructive example where there were 1.4 million mail-in ballot requests, and Allegheny County, which as a Pittsburgh native I view as the jewel in the Commonwealth's crown, dropped its mail-in ballot totals at like 8:01 p.m., like a minute after the polls closed. So I think that is much more representative of what the count is going to look like in 2024. There will just be fewer mail-in ballot requests this year than there were in 2020. I think we are currently around 1.4 million. There's about a month left until the deadline, so it will be more, but it's not going to hit 2020 totals. More people have kind of started going back to voting in person. So I think we don't want to drum up expectations that the count, even though, they can't start counting the mail-in ballots until 7 a.m. on election day, that remains the case. I don't think we want to sort of drum up expectations that this is going to drag on for days.
That sounds great. Well, and that'd be a relief to the voters of Pennsylvania and everybody else around the country that's watching Pennsylvania. So let's hope that that prediction is true. Jennifer, what's your thought about what's going to be different in 2024?
Sure. Well, again, thank you so much for letting me join. Just +1 to what Emma just said. I think we need to make sure we don't undervalue what 4 years of experience by these officials in learning to more efficiently and accurately process ballots is going to bring. I guess something I would highlight is we've seen significant turnover in Pennsylvania. There's been some tremendous efforts by building on Kathy's, former Secretary Bookovar's great work to train and professionalize election administrators in the Commonwealth. But look, honest human mistakes happen. And I would just say, this is echoing, I guess, a little bit, Kathy, I think of what you were saying. That doesn't mean fraud or malfeasance occurred. So being really thoughtful about when an error, an issue happens, whether that's on election day, whether that's during the counting or something that surfaces during the canvass and certification process, to try to understand what it is that actually happened and whether that was a human mistake. Most of those that occurred don't impact the outcome of an election. They don't impact voters' ability to vote, but they can be blown up very quickly in the media. On that note, I guess just one final thing. We've seen tremendous efforts this year by state and local officials across the country, but especially in Pennsylvania, to really try to better communicate the complexity of elections, both in person and mail. So I'd encourage everyone, if you're not already, to really go to those resources that are on the Secretary's webpage, that are on individual county web pages. I've seen great FAQs, social media posts, one-page information explainers that I think will be tremendously helpful in navigating the next 30, 40 days.
That makes sense. And many of those resources are also posted in the resource section at electionovertime.org. And if there's any that we haven't posted that you think we should, I invite the panel and folks in the audience to share those with us. And we're going to continue to treat that as a live resource for reporters and others that are covering the election closely. So I want us to shift for just a second, though, to what's happening in the courts right now, because there's a handful of things in terms of current litigation that are affecting the way that this upcoming 2024 election will be handled. And Emma, this is back to you. And if you don't mind, let's focus mostly on our mail-in ballots piece because we're running a little close on time.
Yep, absolutely. Pennsylvania tends in the last couple of years has attracted just a absolute gargantuan amount of litigation. And as Secretary Boockvar alluded to earlier, many of the issues that we're currently actively litigating are issues that came up in 2020 that have not yet been fully resolved. So the mail-in ballot rules are sort of, I'm going to focus on those because those are going to be front and center in a lot of the litigation you may need to report on. As you know, when you request a mail-in ballot from the from your Board of Elections, you get your ballot. You get an inner envelope that has no identifying markings on it whatsoever. That's the so-called secrecy envelope. And then you get an outer envelope. And the outer envelope has a voter declaration that voters must sign and date with the day that they are filling the ballot out. And it also has a barcode. And when the voter mails back the mail-in ballot, the Board of Elections scans in the barcode, and that is the time that gets logged in the statewide uniform register of electors, or the SURE system, as the date the ballot was received. And in Pennsylvania, we have a receipt deadline, not a postmark deadline. So the question has come up because this was like a fairly frequent error that voters were making. What happens when a voter either fails to handwrite a date on the outer envelope or writes the wrong date? What we have seen a lot is that, the voter declaration sort of is it's kind of affidavit-like, and some people automatically write their birth date, like it's they're kind of attesting to their identity. In 2022, I think somebody ran the numbers, I think the Department of State, in one of the lawsuits, and found that, the people who are most likely to make this particular error are voters over 70, right? So the question is, if there's no date or the wrong date, does it even matter if there's nothing else wrong with the ballot, given that the Board of Elections has this barcode scan as the time at which the ballot was timely received? This has been litigated under a couple of different legal theories, two of which I'll talk about very briefly, both of which are still live in some sense. So the first theory is that throwing out a ballot that is otherwise good but lacks a date or has the wrong date violates the materiality provision of the Federal Civil Rights Act. And the materiality provision in brief says you can't throw out ballots over requirements that don't go to whether a voter is qualified to vote or not, right? So these things kind of feel to us kind of like literacy tests, those kinds of requirements. You can't say the ballot has to be filled out in blue ink and toss out a bunch of ballots that are filled out in red ink, because what difference does it make what color the ballot is filled out in? That legal argument was filed initially in federal court because it's a federal issue, and it kind of bounced up from the district court to the Third Circuit, up to SCOTUS, which vacated on other grounds, and then went back down to a district court, back up to the Third Circuit, and now the ACLU has filed a cert petition in front of SCOTUS to settle the issue, and that presumably will be the final word, but that's still ongoing. That case is called that's the Pennsylvania State Conference of the NAACP versus Schmidt. The second thing, yeah.
I'm gonna jump in for one quick second. So time frame on that. What's the predicted time frame for us to have that for that ruling to come down? And does it have an impact on the activities that are currently underway by clerks? Or Kathy, is that Emma or Kathy, either one, jump in on that piece.
Time frame, you know, SCOTUS can either grant the cert petition and take the case, in which case then there will be briefing and argument, or it can deny cert. I hate guessing about these kinds of things. My intuition is that they are likely to deny cert, but I don't know. The denial of cert would certainly be faster than if there's briefing and argument. But in any event, this would have to be decided before Election Day, before the canvass of the ballots begins.
Got it. Okay, so a related question, jumping for 1 second. Secretary Bookvar, you mentioned when we were talking prior to the call, a little bit of a few issues that you were thinking about in terms of what voters needed to know about the mail ballot situation, this is a situation where we want people to have good confidence going into 2024 about how that system works and what's available to them. Do you have anything you want to add in on that particular topic based upon the legal context that Emma just provided to the group?
Yeah, I mean, what I've been saying, as everyone can tell from Emma's presentation, and I think you've only gotten through even part of it, right? There's a lot of cases flying on these issues. And so I actually think the most important thing to communicate in the press to voters is ignore the noise of the litigation. You just need to know 3 things. Use your secrecy envelope, make sure your ballot goes in the secrecy envelope, sign the outer envelope, and put today's date on the outer envelope. Ignore the litigation, because really the most important thing here is voter education. How many times have the rules changed? How many times they still may change? For the purpose of the voters, we should just stick to voter education.
Fair enough.
Completely agree.
I want to jump. I know that, Emma, there's more we could talk about on litigation, but I'm worried about time because we've got these amazing questions that are coming in on the Q&A from our reporters. And so we are going to heads up, collect those questions along the way. And in the last 10 or 15 minutes of this brief, we're going to be bringing you all into the big room with us so that you can ask those questions. So you can keep on, folks in the audience, posting your questions in the Q&A. Before we start to take those, though, what I would like to do, if I could, is shift to Jennifer, who has a lot of expertise around audits. And what we know is that voters really worry about how the auditing process works, and they don't understand it very well. So, Jennifer, can you give us a high-level understanding of what are they, what aren't they, and what do we most need to know about how they're going to work in Pennsylvania?
Sure. So there are 2 audit methods in Pennsylvania that ensure ballots were interpreted and tabulated correctly and the outcome of the election is correct. The first is something we call a fixed percentage audit. This is where a predetermined percentage of ballots are randomly selected and they're hand tallied and they're compared to the machine count. And in Pennsylvania, the requirement is for 2% of ballots or 2,000 ballots, whichever is less in each county. And all items on the ballot, that means every single contest, is reviewed and tallied as part of this audit. This 2% recount, or this 2% audit, is done as part of the canvas. We also have something called a risk limiting audit, and similar to a fixed percentage audit, we do a random selection of ballots. Those are reviewed by humans. The thing that's different about an RLA is the sample size. So rather than having a fixed percentage, that sample is based on the margin of victory between the winning and losing candidate on the audited contest. So the closer the results, the more ballots that need to be reviewed. The wider the margin, the fewer we can look at and still feel confident about the outcome. And this audit is designed to increase in scale and even escalate to a full hand count, depending on the discrepancies that are discovered. And risk limiting audits, specifically the batch comparison method, is also performed in Pennsylvania. It's required that one or more randomly selected statewide contests is selected and audited by the counties. So the thing I would emphasize is both of these types of audits use human eyes to review and tally a certain number of ballots and compare those to findings to the machine count. Then real quick, I think distinguishing between audits and recounts, I get asked this a lot, and I'm sure it's a question that reporters have. I just note that an audit is a routine part of the post-election process. It's designed to ensure the systems worked as expected. It is not a bad word. It's something that helps with process improvement. It's the way that election officials can ensure things are working accurately. A recount is performed in response to something that may have gone wrong or something that happened in a specific contest, such as a close margin, or it could be initiated automatically by statute or requested by a candidate. And audits like those in PA, as I mentioned, are always done by hand counting the ballots selected for audit. Recounts, on the other hand, typically involve rescanning ballots for those that either the particular ballots or that are being recounted, particular contest, jurisdiction, precinct, etc. Those are usually ran back through the machines and recounted. A couple other things to think about again. Audits, we have a random selection of all the ballots, so any ballot might be potentially chosen for the audit. Again, in a recount, we focus on specific contests. I guess the last thing I'll just add there is that well-designed audits really help improve voter confidence, or we hope that they will, in the outcome. They're checking as part of that audit, not just how the machine interpreted and tallied and tabulated those ballots, but often they are looking at chain of custody requirements and other essential processes to ensure everything was done according to law and done correctly.
That's great. All right. So the thing that we know is that the information that we just shared on the audits is just one small piece. It is a piece that is consistently misunderstood by voters. So Jennifer has a series of resources that talk about how audits work, and they go beyond what was on that one slide. So if we don't have, Jennifer, your resources, those couple of fact sheets you shared with me in advance, if we don't have those on the Election Overtime website, we're going to add them right after this call. So let's circle back and for everybody in the audience to know that those are going to be available to you. We're going to take one last very quick round robin question to the whole group, and then we're going to start going to questions in the audience. And so this is like a wish list. One wish, 30 seconds or less, one wish that you have for public awareness of the electoral process in 2024. That can include one wish that you just wish voters had, or one wish for how you'd like the media to be thinking about how they're handling the election that's coming up. And we're going to start, Judge Jones, with you.
I think that what folks need to know is that because our General Assembly lacks the political will to fix a broken election code, that we do not have appropriate pre-canvassing in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And so pre-canvassing can only start on Election Day when the polls open. That's a dreadful flaw, and it leads to delayed results, even though I think, to echo my co-panelists, the count is going to go more quickly this year. Because there's no pandemic, there should be fewer votes to count, and I think folks got an education in 2020 and have more staff to count votes. But again, echoing my co-panelists, it's going to be a couple of days, and that will lead into the narrative that there have been these phantom vote drops and something nefarious is going on, and it's not that at all. It's a no excuse mail voting law that doesn't have a corollary provision that allows pre-canvassing that will trigger that.
All right, fair enough. Thank you so much, sir. Secretary Bookvar, one wish for public awareness of the electoral process in 2024.
Well, 100% agree with Judge Jones, same wish. And I'll just add, and by the way, from a press point of view, reinforcement of that point, you can't say it enough, because like that is why we have the delay. It is 100% caused by the legislature's failure to do this. And we are one of, I think, maybe 5 states in the entire country that don't allow it. So helpful to reinforce that with the public. I guess the only other thing I would say is any reinforcement press could make to the public about all the layers of security that go into mail-in votes. And I know we don't have time, probably, Heather, for me to go through them all now, but I'm happy to follow up with everybody. And I'll just, like the barcode, which Heather mentioned earlier, every mail-in ballot return envelope has a barcode that is programmed solely for the individual who has applied and already been approved. So like that's a fact that voters don't tend to know and really need to know. So I'd love to, I'm always happy to answer questions in the weeds on all this stuff, should anybody want to follow up on any of this stuff.
All right, thank you, Secretary. Emma, your one wish for what the public knows in the 2024 process.
I think that it would be great for media coverage of lawsuits to not emphasize, but just sort of be cognizant of the fact that anybody can file a lawsuit as long as they have the filing fee, and that allegations in lawsuits are not necessarily facts, and that especially when you are dealing with people who have already demonstrated that they are not filing in good faith, or they have an agenda, that a lot of these should be looked at with skepticism and not necessarily kind of swallowed as factual just on the basis of a complaint.
Fair enough. Thank you, Emma. Jennifer, one
Sure.
wish for the public awareness in 2024?
Learn about all of the daily, weekly, monthly, yearly checks that are happening in election offices to validate the voter registration database to ensure that that list is accurate and up to date, and learn about all of the steps that are taken both pre and post-election to ensure the election is accurate. That's both for in-person voting, early voting, mail ballot voting, election day voting. There are many, many steps that are done both before and after the election to do that validation. So take the time to learn what those are.
Great. All right. So what we're going to do now, if it's all right, is shift to some of the questions that are in our chat. And if you are a reporter who's offered one of these in the chat and you'd like to voice your question to us out loud, just raise your hand and we can migrate you into the big room. You'll get an invitation to, quote, join the panel, and say yes to that if you'd like to come hang out in this room with us. But I'm going to start right quick with Steve Ulrich from Politics Pennsylvania, who asks, I think this is a question specifically, Secretary Bookvar, for you. We had 8,000 provisional ballots to count in the days after the 2020 election, which takes time to do accurately. Can you talk a little bit more beyond what we've already described about that challenge, and then what you see as the challenge going forward for 2024?
Yeah, I mean, so I share the general optimism that counting will be faster this year than 2020. However, there are parts of the process that we will not have results the night of the election, period. And that's in part because we allow in Pennsylvania overseas and military voters their ballots don't need to be received until 7 days after the election. So we don't want to disenfranchise people serving our country. And also provisional ballots take time. Provisional ballots have to be individually adjudicated. There's as Steve mentioned, there are thousands and thousands of these ballots, and they can each be challenged, and they take time. And these are good guardrails that we have, because it's important that we make sure, A, that everybody can securely cast their ballots, and B, that we're checking that everyone is eligible, right? Like the balance of eligibility and security and accessibility all need to be had, and that takes time. So I think Steve's point, from a press perspective, letting voters understand that the time is actually good. The time is care. The time is consistency and accuracy and reconciliation and audits and challenges. All that needs to be taken, which is why in Pennsylvania, we don't have certification by the counties until 20 days after the election. And so reminding folks of all those pieces, and Steve, it's great that you have that particular experience, because you really can explain why this time is important.
All right. Thank you, Secretary. I want to jump to the question, Judge Jones, that's directed to you regarding a perceived strategy by some to use lawsuits to sort of advance a political message.
I have it, Heather.
You have it? I want to say it out loud for folks that can't see that
Okay,
chat. So,
sure.
So the main thing is just we want to understand what's the fact-finding process of the courts. So we can help journalists differentiate between political messaging and facts of the case. Off to you, sir.
Certainly. If you have an opportunity to listen to argument in a particular case, do that because it can be very enlightening. You may need some help to break it down, and read the judge's opinion. And again, if you need help in breaking it down, you can get some expert help to do that. And I'll give you a quick example. In the Trump versus Bookvar case, in particular, where Kathy was a defendant, where the secretary was a defendant, there was a question from the presiding judge, Judge Brand, and he said to Mayor Giuliani, is your case based on allegations of fraud? And Giuliani, who evidently didn't know his own case, said, no, it's not. The pleadings in the case were shot through with allegations of fraud. He directly contradicted everything that was before the judge, which is one of the reasons that he lost his ability to practice law in certain jurisdictions. And then look at the decision, because the decision by the judge was a striking rebuke of the lawsuit. So the fact-finding process or the legal process, if you will, typically comes out in those two mechanisms, and you should listen carefully to those as they go through. There is, of course, that gloss of messaging through litigation. One other thing, I think this year, apropos, what happened to Mayor Giuliani, I think lawyers are going to be much more reluctant to take cases that are like this, that have non-existent proof, because what we found in 2020 was they did it, and I agree with Emma that all you need is the fee to file a case, but you better be careful. Certainly when you go to federal court, if you do that, you may jeopardize your right to practice law, and I think lawyers are on notice about that.
So another thing that, thank you, Judge, another thing that people are nervous about, and it's not so much a messaging issue as it is a flat out understanding of the timeline piece. And so, Judge, I think this one stays with you, which is this last question from Rachel Levin around the expectation that Pennsylvania is going to meet the presidential timeline for ECRA. Now, that's more than we have time to do in 2 minutes, but why don't you give us the highlights and where reporters can go to find information as it relates to Electoral Count Reform Act and the timeline to for Pennsylvania to meet it?
Well, watch this. I think I could do a couple at the same time. There's one question that has to do with what folks should be reading up on. You should read up on the recount process in Pennsylvania, because it's kind of messy. It's rather counterintuitive, and it's based on an almost 100-year-old law, again, that the General Assembly won't fix. And because of that, that runs headlong potentially into the deadline that's set in the Electoral Count Reform Act, or ECRA as it's called. And there is the possibility that if there are repeated recounts that throw kind of a wrench into the gears here, that you could run right up against the deadline. And that may necessitate, and Kathy, you may have a perspective on this, but I think there could be a scenario where the Secretary of the Commonwealth has to file a mandamus action against certain counties to get them to finish the count if they're recalcitrant or if they just can't get out of their own way in terms of counting. There is no written mechanism that syncs the Pennsylvania certification with ECRA, with the federal provision. One hopes, because it's for the public good, that the votes will get counted and there'll be a certification, and we'll see what happens. But that's something to look at, and particularly, I think, read up on recounts, because it is a rather confounding area of the law that hasn't been fixed.
All
And
right.
I'll just
Yep.
say two things, which is, I agree with Judge Jones, and I think that I am 99.9% confident that the justice system, which did a fabulous job in 2020, whether it's through mandamus actions, my hope is that the commissioners, the boards of elections, all just do their jobs. But if not, the mandamus actions will happen, and the officials are subject to criminal and civil liability. Like, it's no joke in Pennsylvania. Jail time is not something that any election official wants to serve. So I am really confident that Pennsylvania across the board will meet those deadlines.
Very good. Thank you, ma'am. I'm going to quickly share my screen again for just one quick second and let you know that Kevin Johnson and we have our own answer to this question of what did we most wish that people would read up on in advance. And there's a page on the election overtime website, what voters need to know about the presidential election. And it is our hope that as journalists are considering what to write on between now and election day, they might take a look at this list and see how we can elaborate on public education in this space. So that's one thing. The other thing I'm going to quickly share with you is that this is one of a series of briefings. These will happen in multiple states between now and mid-October. And then just prior to the election, we'll have another national one. And then we're going to see what the needs of the nation are in terms of additional post-election briefings. So stay tuned to the announcements that come to you through the Election Overtime program on when there will be more opportunities to weigh in on these activities. Now, that's going to mean I'm going to officially wrap up this discussion. However, it is my understanding that we have two more reporters with questions in the audience. So I'm going to let folks know if you need to leave, go for it. If you have time to stick around, I'm hoping that we might be able to take one or two of those additional questions from our folks in the audience. And Kim, you can migrate anybody in while folks are deciding if they can stick around. Maybe. Steve, it looks to me like you're here and we can hear you. Well, maybe not. I can see that it says you can talk. Let's try one more time. There you go. Just unmute yourself. You're with us now, sir.
I was just going to say, Heather, thank you so much for doing this. You already answered my question. Secretary Bookbar already took care of that one. Thank you.
Oh, very good. Thank you. So are there any others that are pending in the big room? Looks like not. All right, then we are in fact going to give it a wrap. Thank you all so very much for engaging in this work with us today. Thank you to our panelists for being so smart and committed to the American democratic process. And we are hoping that all of you will stay engaged with this project all the way through to Inauguration Day in January. That's how long we're with you on this. So thanks so much for your time. We'll talk to you soon.
Everyone,
Thank you.
great job, everyone on the panel. Really appreciate all your hard work on this.
Thanks for doing it.
Thank you.